Okay, in order to graph this function, you need to start by finding the amplitude, period, and phase shift. To find the amplitude, it's always the number that is in front of the sine. And in order to find the period for a sine graph is always 2 pi, and you divide it by the number that comes after the sine. And so for this function, you get 4 pi. And then the phase shift is the number that is inside the parentheses, and that is pi over 2. So we take our period and divide it into 4 and shift all of those points pi over 2 to the left. And so then we get these points, and we need to put them on our graph. And then once you have them all graphed, you also need to add your amplitude, which is 4 and -4. And then for a sine graph, you always start, with 0. And then you go up and in here. And then you're finished.
So in order to graph this function, which is y equals tangent 1/2 times x minus pi over 4, we need to find our period right here, and we need to find the phase shift, which is right here. In order to get the period for a tangent graph, we use pi divided by 1/2, and that equals 2 pi. So that 2 pi is our period. In order to get our phase shift, we look at what's in the parentheses, and we end up with pi over 4, and that shift is to the right. So our phase shift is pi over 4 to the right. And then every tangent graph has 3 key points. In order to find these key points, you do 2 pi, which is our period, divided by 2, and we end up with pi as our key points. So our key points are -pi, 0, and pi. And at -pi and at pi, we have asymptotes. And then 0 is where we cross the x-axis. But we have a phase shift 2 over pi, or pi over 4 to the right. So our new asymptote becomes -3 pi over 4. Our new 0 becomes pi over 4. And our new asymptote becomes 5 pi over 4. So you come down to the graph and you graph these points. So you put down 3 pi over 4, pi over 4, 5 pi over 4. And we have asymptotes at -3 pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4, so we draw these lines. And then we cross the x-axis at pi over 4, which is right here, and the tangent graph looks like this. And that's it.
Okay, so in order to graph this starting function, you first need to find out that your guide graph is -2 cosine 2x minus pi. And you always want your x to be alone, so you need to take out a 2 from the parentheses, and so you get y equals -2 cosine 2 of x minus pi over 2. So then you find out you have an amplitude of 2, and you also have a negative sign right here, which means that you need to flip over the x-axis. And then you have a phase shift of pi over 2 to the right. And so your period for a cosine graph is always 2 pi. And since you have a 2 right here, you need to divide your period by 2, and you get pi. And then once you divide pi into your 5 key points, you get 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. And so once you do your phase shift of pi over 2 to the right, these are your key points that you will end with. And so you plot those on your graph. You have pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, pi, 5 pi over 4, and 3 pi over 2. And so this is your starting graph, and the final one will end up looking, after you do your flip, will look like that, and then you're finished.